I had always lived a life of predictability, one where every step seemed to fall into place, as if following an unwritten script. My name is Adam Crawford, and for more than a decade, I dedicated myself to the same company, having joined shortly after finishing college. Around the same time, I married Grace, my wife, a relationship that had unfolded in the most conventional way. Ours was a traditional romance, comfortable and expected, leading naturally into marriage. I had always envisioned a big family, a house filled with the warmth of children's laughter, but Grace never shared that dream. She had no desire to be a mother. For years, I never questioned our relationship. It was steady, familiar, and I assumed that was enough. But a few weeks ago, something shifted. At first, the unease crept in subtly, small inconsistencies, minor deviations in her routine. I brushed them aside, convincing myself that I was overanalyzing insignificant details. Yet, no matter how much I tried to rationalize my discomfort, it wouldn't fade. A gnawing suspicion took root, and soon, I could no longer ignore it. I decided to uncover the truth. Wednesday seemed to be the most suspicious day, so I focused my attention there. That morning, before heading to work, I discreetly tucked a GPS tracker beneath the back seat of Grace's BMW. To ensure uninterrupted tracking, I disabled its auto shutdown function and replaced the batteries with fresh ones. With that, I left for work, my mind divided between my responsibilities and the digital breadcrumbs I hoped to collect. The day crawled by, each hour stretching endlessly. The moment I could reasonably leave, I did. My heart pounded as I pulled into our driveway, where Grace's car was already parked as if nothing had changed. I retrieved the tracking device, my fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside me. I wasted no time analyzing the recorded locations. The device had worked flawlessly, mapping out her every movement throughout the day. Following the path it traced, I found myself standing before a Holiday Inn near the airport. Inside, I approached the front desk with an air of casual confidence. With a polite smile, I explained that my wife had attended a business meeting here and had left behind a valuable pair of sunglasses. When the receptionist asked for the room number, I feigned ignorance, offering only her name instead. He hesitated, then smirked slightly before checking the system. His next words confirmed everything I had feared. Grace had stayed in room 410 and checked out at 3 p.m. He suggested I speak with the cleaning staff, as the room hadn't yet been serviced. A discreet cash incentive secured me access. The moment I stepped inside, my worst suspicions crystallized into undeniable truth. The bed lay in disarray, the sheets unmade, towels damp from recent use. But it was the wastebasket that sealed my fate. 3 used condoms discarded among crumpled tissues and empty wrappers. I collected them, wrapping them carefully before making my way downstairs, my mind cold and calculating. At the front desk, I took another risk. This time, I slid a larger bill across the counter and inquired about obtaining a copy of the floor's surveillance footage. The clerk didn't hesitate. Instead of making a duplicate, he handed me the original tape and inserted a fresh one into the recorder. I accepted it with a steady hand and left, surprisingly composed. That evening, Grace moved through our home as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't spent her afternoon wrapped in another man's arms. I resisted the urge to confront her immediately. Instead, I focused on planning my next move. Once she went to bed, I watched the surveillance tape. That was when I saw him. A forgettable face, the kind of man who blended into the background. But I knew him. A quick search through company records confirmed his identity. Anthony Robinson, a mid-level manager. Married. His wife, Eleanor, was a petite woman with dark hair and a cuvia frame. I recognized her from corporate events, an attractive but unassuming presence. As I pieced together the truth, I became aware of another observer. My secretary, Cassie, had been watching me closely. She had always been sharp, possessing an uncanny ability to sense when something was amiss. One afternoon, she leaned against my desk with a knowing smirk. "Need help?" she asked. I met her gaze. A good secretary always knew when her boss was hiding something. I accepted. Cassie dug into Grace's credit card statements and phone records. I hadn't even mentioned Anthony's name, yet when she handed me her findings, His records were included as well. That realization stung more than I expected. She had figured out what I refused to say aloud. Then another unexpected clue appeared. A business card for a divorce attorney found its way onto my desk. I had no idea who left it, but I slipped it into my pocket, filing it away for later consideration. That night, Grace and I followed our usual routine. Minimal conversation, separate bedtimes, an ever-widening gulf of silence between us. My mind was racing ahead, calculating my next move. By Friday, Cassie delivered more than I had anticipated. Not only had she acquired Grace's phone records, but she had secured Anthony's as well. Before the day ended, she leaned in again, her voice laced with amusement. "You should talk to Eleanor at the company picnic," she suggested. Then after a pause, "And maybe have a word with Jake Williamson. Jake, our CEO." She winked before walking away. That night, as Grace sat beside me, reading in bed, I stared at the television, my thoughts elsewhere. It was time to act. The company picnic was a blur of laughter, clinking glasses, and idle chatter. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves. Everyone except me. My friend Bob noticed. "Hope you cheer up before next year's picnic, Adam," he teased. I smirked. "I doubt I'll be here next year, Bob." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Are you quitting?" I met his gaze, my voice calm. "No. I just think I'll be in prison by then." A hush fell over the group. The air shifted. Bob forced a chuckle. "What are you talking about?" I leaned back, taking a slow sip of my drink. "Well, Bob, someone in this company has been sleeping with my wife. And very soon, I'm going to kill him. His wife. And his kids." Silence. At the far end of the table, Anthony went rigid. I didn't acknowledge him directly. Just as the moment threatened to spiral, Bill Thomas broke the tension with a laugh. "Well, Adam," he grinned. "If that's the case, can I have your boat?" The mood shifted. Laughter returned. I played along. "The boat's worth 10 grand. You can have it for 4. Bill considered. "If you're serious, we've got a deal." "Done. You can pick it up tomorrow." Then I turned to Stan. "Still want those ping golf clubs? $100. Stan nodded. "I'll grab them Sunday." As I spoke, Anthony quietly excused himself. He pulled out his phone. Across the yard, Grace reached into her purse and answered. Their conversation was brief. She must have felt my eyes on her, because she ended the call quickly. By the time Anthony returned, I had also sold my truck. It was turning into a productive picnic. As I stood in the midst of the company picnic, the air thick with idle chatter and clinking glasses, I recalled Cassie's advice. My gaze swept across the crowd until I spotted Jake Williamson, our CEO, engaged in conversation with a group of executives. I barely had time to approach before he grabbed my arm, his voice low but firm. "Don't worry, I've got your back," he murmured. I wasn't sure what he meant, but there was something reassuring in his tone. Promising even. Before I could process it further, another presence appeared beside me, Eleanor. Her 2 young children clung to her hands as she brushed against me slightly, just enough to make contact without drawing attention. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk. I'll call you." And just like that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than answers. I turned my attention back to my own situation. Grace was standing across the lawn, laughing at something someone had said, her expression light, carefree, unbothered. The sight of her ignited something deep within me, something cold and resolute. I approached her, my voice steady when I spoke. "Leave with me now," I said, "or find another ride." Her eyes flickered with something, hesitation? Guilt? Either way, she didn't argue. She simply nodded and followed me to the car. The drive home was suffocating in its silence. Neither of us spoke, the air between us charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. By the time we arrived, I felt something shift inside me, a measure of control I hadn't felt in weeks. I was no longer reacting. I was leading. The next morning, I woke early, feeling strangely refreshed. It was as if the weight pressing down on me had lightened, just a fraction. I threw myself into tasks that had no real urgency, but helped keep my mind focused. I prepared the golf clubs for Stan, a silent message that he would undoubtedly understand. Then I moved on to the truck, meticulously washing and waxing it until the surface gleamed. I knew something was coming, and I was ready. The boat was the most time-consuming, so I saved it for last, estimating it would take the entire morning to get it into top condition for Bill. As I worked outside, I caught glimpses of Grace through the window, her posture tense as she sat glued to her phone. No doubt she and Anthony had plenty to discuss. A part of me wished I had found a way to record her calls. But in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't have changed much. Stan arrived to pick up the golf clubs, giving me a firm nod that said more than words could. Afterward, I stepped inside to fix myself a sandwich and grab a beer before heading back out. Bill showed up right on time, and we spent over an hour going over the boat's wiring and fuel system. I even handed over my entire collection of fishing gear. Without a boat, I had no use for it anymore. The day passed in a whirlwind of activity, a steady rhythm that kept me from dwelling too much on the inevitable confrontation that still loomed over me. After a quick shower, I dressed and casually asked Grace if she wanted to go out for dinner. She declined. No reason, no explanation. What struck me most wasn't her refusal, but the fact that she never once asked about the boat, the truck, or the golf clubs. She was avoiding the subject, avoiding me. That suited me just fine. I treated myself to a great meal anyway, followed by a stop at a local bar, where I let the weight of the day melt away, if only for a little while. By the time I returned home, Grace was already asleep, and when I left for work the next morning, she was still in bed. On a whim, I made an uncharacteristic stop at the International House of Pancakes. It wasn't something I usually did, but today felt different. I took my time, sipping coffee, reading the newspaper, indulging in the simple pleasure of an unhurried morning, before finally making my way to the office around 10 a.m. The moment I stepped in, I noticed something was off. The air buzzed with an unusual energy. People greeted me with more warmth than usual, their smiles lingering just a little longer. Cassie smirked as she handed me a coffee I hadn't asked for. "What's going on?" I asked, suspicious of her expression. She leaned against my desk, grinning. "You've become quite the office legend." I frowned. "And that's supposed to be a good thing?" Her grin widened. "Word about your little display at the picnic has spread like wildfire." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Great." She laughed. "Oh, it gets better. Anthony was here early this morning. He put in for an immediate transfer." That caught my attention. "Did he now?" "Didn't give a reason," she continued. "But Mr. Williamson had already arranged for his reassignment to the Baltimore office before he even asked. He packed up his desk and was gone within an hour." Damn, I hadn't expected my words at the picnic to have that much of an impact. Cassie smirked. Apparently he looked like a terrified rabbit. I leaned back in my chair considering. Did he take his wife and kids with him? "No," she said. "He sent them to her parents' place in Maine. Eleanor wasn't pleased. She called the office looking for you. Said she needed to talk. Seemed urgent." I nodded. "Guess I'll wait and see what she wants." At home, the tension between Grace and me remained thick, almost tangible. We only spoke when necessary, both of us sidestepping the inevitable conversation. That night, I didn't even bother going to the bedroom. I crashed on the couch instead. The next morning, I took the first step toward untangling our lives. I shut down our joint bank accounts and credit cards, leaving Grace with only the one in her name. I withdrew $1,000 in cash, sealed it in an envelope, preparation for when the time came. The checking account and ATM access? Deactivated. The BMW was hers legally, but I carried the insurance, so I canceled it. Her phone was separate, so there was nothing to adjust there. Right before lunch, Eleanor called. We met at a McDonald's, her choice a smart one. A neutral public space, easy to blend into. Her children played nearby as she sat across from me, her expression unreadable. She didn't waste time. Anthony sent us to Maine without an explanation. When I called his secretary Monday morning, I found out he had transferred. Then I heard a rumor, one that I find hard to believe. I raised an eyebrow. "What rumor?" "That you threatened to kill him, me and our kids," she said dryly. I scoffed. "Ridiculous." She smirked. "That's what I thought." We shared a quiet laugh before she got serious. We both know what's really happening, she said. I need to know what evidence you have. If you show me yours, I'll show you mine. I met her gaze, then nodded. I have 3 months' worth of phone logs for both Grace and Anthony. Credit card statements, showing hotel bookings at the airport Holiday Inn. Video footage of them coming and going time-stamped. I hesitated for a beat. And 3 used condoms. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Your turn. Eleanor leaned in. I have voice recordings of their explicit calls. About 40 incriminating photos, don't ask how I got them. She smirked. And an excellent lawyer willing to handle? Both cases. If you're on board. I pulled the business card from my pocket and placed it on the table. She smiled. Despite everything, I found I enjoyed spending time with Eleanor and her kids. We stayed until they were too exhausted to play any longer, then parted ways. That afternoon, we exchanged evidence, setting the stage for our meeting the next morning. That night at home, nothing changed. The lawyer was sharp, thorough, efficient. Divorce and settlements were now inevitable. Later, as the dust began to settle, I glanced at Eleanor and asked, "Feel like getting dinner?" Eleanor agreed to dinner, provided she could find a sitter. I told her I didn't mind if the kids came along, but she preferred otherwise. I respected her choice. As I got ready for the evening, Grace sat in silence, her expression unreadable. I didn't offer an explanation as I walked out the door. Dinner with Eleanor was easy, effortless. For the first time in a long while, I enjoyed someone's company without the weight of betrayal hanging over me. We talked about everything, childhood memories, favorite movies, the best vacation spots. But never once did we mention our divorces. For a few hours, we were simply two people sharing a meal, laughing, and forgetting the chaos that surrounded us. When I dropped her off, I kissed her lightly on the cheek before leaving. It was nothing grand, just a quiet moment of understanding. When I returned home, Grace was already in bed, as if my absence hadn't even registered. The next morning I focused on work. Cassie had covered for me, but I had plenty to catch up on. I buried myself in emails, spreadsheets, and reports, letting the normalcy of the office drown out the lingering emotions from the night before. That evening after dinner, I made a decision. It was time to end this once and for all. Spreading newspaper across the kitchen table, I carefully disassembled my old Army-issued .45, methodically cleaning each piece. The ritual was familiar, calming in its own way. Grace stood in the doorway watching me for a long moment before stepping forward, her voice sharp with suspicion. "What the hell are you doing?" she snapped. Without looking up, I answered, "I have unfinished business in Baltimore." Her face paled slightly. "What do you mean by that?" "It's personal," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. She began pacing, her anxiety obvious. Finally, she stopped in front of me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want you to go," she said, her voice tight. "You're about to do something reckless, and I think you should reconsider." I didn't waver. "I have to do this." She leaned over the table, her anger barely contained. "I don't care what happens to you," she hissed. "Just don't hurt him. Do you hear me? Don't hurt him." I met her gaze unflinching. That was all the confirmation I needed. She sat down aggressively, her eyes burning with frustration. "I don't know what you think is happening, but you need to stop this nonsense. People are saying you believe I'm cheating. You have no reason to suspect anything. Quit acting like a fool." Calmly, I reached for my briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of papers, and slid them across the table. "Here," I said, my voice steady. "Your phone records for the past 3 months. Want to guess how many times you called him?" Her expression didn't change as she glanced at the documents. I placed another stack in front of her. "This is a complete log of his phone records. Care to guess how many times he called you?" "Daily." She crossed her arms and shrugged. "Calls don't mean a thing." Wordlessly, I slid a cassette tape across the table. "This contains several rather intimate conversations between you two. Do you want to listen? Or do you already know them by heart?" She didn't move. I pulled out credit card statements next, setting them neatly in front of her. "You even paid for the hotel rooms." Her eyes flickered to the receipts, her mouth tightening. "Well," she muttered, "wasn't that generous of him?" 14 different hotels in 3 months, I said, my tone laced with mock admiration. "That's impressive." Did his wife ever catch on? For a split second, her composure wavered. But irritation quickly replaced it. I reached into my bag one last time and placed a VHS tape beside the receipts. This has footage of you both walking into a motel and leaving 3 hours later. All time-stamped. She swallowed hard, her hands clenched into fists. If that's not enough, I continued, my voice unwavering, I also have 40 crystal-clear photographs of you two completely exposed, trying out every position imaginable. I spread the photos across the table, making sure she got a good look. She barely glanced at them before letting out a sharp breath. Enough, she snapped. Stop. You're dumping too much on me at once. I can't think straight when you're attacking me like this. There was no remorse in her voice. No apology. Just irritation. I gathered everything, sliding it back into my briefcase. The handgun, too, was secured inside. She remained silent, her eyes locked on the table. Standing, I grabbed my coat and moved toward the door. I'm staying at a motel tonight, I told her. When I return, I expect you and anything that belongs to you to be gone. If you leave anything behind, I'll have it shipped. Your Discover card still works, but I've canceled all the others. I placed an envelope on the table. There's $1,000 in there. Maybe use some of it to get car insurance. She stared at the envelope before looking up at me. And where exactly am I supposed to go? I smirked. Baltimore is lovely this time of year. I walked out before she could respond. The next day, I had lunch with Eleanor. This time she brought the kids. I found I enjoyed their company more than I expected. Even though they weren't mine, they made me feel grounded. Over the meal, I recounted the events of the previous night. Eleanor listened carefully, trying to remain neutral. But given the circumstances, that was impossible. After lunch I swung by the house. Grace was gone. She had done a meticulous job clearing out her things, as if she had never lived there. It was exactly what I wanted. Later at work, I made a call to my landlord, letting him know I'd be vacating by the end of the month. He had no objections. I no longer needed a big house, so that evening, I started browsing apartment listings. The next morning, Cassie greeted me with a knowing smirk. Grace moved in with Anthony, she said casually. I didn't ask how she knew, though I was mildly curious. Not long after, my lawyer called. The divorce papers, both mine and Anthony's, had been finalized. A courier would deliver them Saturday morning. 90 days, and it would all be official. Everything was expected to proceed smoothly. Cassie appeared again, this time dropping a travel brochure on my desk. You're being forced to take a 10-day vacation, she announced. Inside the folder were 4 airline tickets to Orlando, a week-long resort stay, and park passes for the duration. All courtesy of Jake Williamson. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. I moved in with Eleanor. Life was good. A week later, Anthony lost his job. With alimony, child support, car payments, and no income, he was drowning. Meanwhile, Grace found work, but her luxury car was stolen and totaled. She had never bothered with insurance. Not long after, Anthony packed up and left for Dallas without telling Grace where he was going. Good luck to them both.